Celebrating 49 years on the air, award-winning Farm Week is a production of Mississippi State University Extension.
Today on Farm Week, a comprehensive update on the new World Screwworm crossing the border into Texas. In Southern Gardening, Eddie's in Vicksburg again, this time for an orchid delight. In the markets, with all eyes on the new World Screwworm, Zac has an update on cattle and the challenge to meet beef demand. And in our feature, One Man's Trash, Another Man's Treasure. Farm Week starts right now.
Hello everyone, I'm Zac Ashmore.
And I'm Mike Russell. As always, good to have you with us again here on Farm Week. The new World Screwworm on everyone's radar with the USDA announcement that the parasite has once again been found in the U.S., igniting even more federal effort and greater interest from everyone else. Reporter Laurel Bauer has more.
We have, number one, formed a unified incident command team with the Texas Animal Health Commission and deployed our APHIS response team and personnel to the area. They are already on the ground.
In the wake of the announcement, USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins provided updates on the new World Screwworm situation in a series of meetings with lawmakers and in press calls.
If we all work together and follow animal treatment and the movement restriction guidance, there is no reason to believe that this incursion will result in any sort of establishment of the pest.
NWS is a serious pest that affects livestock, pets, wildlife, and less commonly, people and birds. They most often enter an animal through an open wound and feed on its living flesh. According to USDA, the nation's food supply is safe. Screwworms do not infest meat, fruits, vegetables, or other food sources. It is not contagious and does not spread directly from animals to people or from person to person. The issue quickly became the focus of Thursday's previously scheduled House Agricultural Committee hearing, where lawmakers pressed Rollins on the threat posed to the nation's livestock sector.
We have now activated our new World Screwworm Response Playbook, which includes detailed protocols and procedures for just this scenario. We've established a 20-kilometer zone around the detection and implementing quarantines, movement controls, and surveillance in the region. In fact, I'll be there next week.
In addition, Rollins explained the USDA has accelerated the release of sterile flies, the primary tool used to eradicate screwworm populations. Lawmakers from cattle-producing states expressed concerns for their ranchers, who are already experiencing tight herd numbers and economic uncertainty.
Why should Kansas ranchers and consumers facing high beef prices have confidence that the USDA has this under control?
I was on the phone most of last night and through the night with the ranchers in South Texas. We do not believe this will be an infestation. We'll be able to isolate each case.
The last outbreak in U.S. border states was in the 1960s. It decimated the local wildlife population and caused millions of dollars in damage to ranchers. NWS was eradicated at that time when researchers began releasing massive numbers of sterilized male screwworm flies that mate with wild female flies to produce infertile eggs. Rollins says the nation's first production facility for sterile flies is expected to open in Texas late 2027.
When it does, it'll produce about 300 million flies per week, in addition to the 100 million from Panama. And then we outfitted an additional Mexican facility in Matapa for another $100 million. So we will get back to the point where we're able to push it back and eradicate it.
So far, there have been no further detections reported.
Taking our coverage a step further, I spoke to MSU livestock economist Josh Maples about the screwworm. He had plenty to say about the reappearance of this parasite.
Yeah, so New World Screwworm, there's two sides to this, or there's plenty of sides to this, but the big two sides of this, one is it's absolutely a bad thing. You know, this is a huge problem. It's something that we've dealt with, decades ago, and it was a really huge undertaking to get rid of then. We're now, as we're recording this, I think we're up to like 4 cases total in Texas. And so, yes, it's a really big problem. It's a really big problem that's in your area. The only positive, there's not a positive of us having it. The only positive is that we've hopefully had enough time to prepare for this. This is something the industry's been talking about for a couple of years now. And so, trying to make some efforts to be ready for this moment to happen. And so it's on us. It's a big production cost challenge. And so if you think about the idea of us trying to expand the cow herd and, get to that point where we got more calves and more beef eventually, screwworm is something that leads to higher production costs for producers. Number one, it's just more management time. They've got to be out there checking their cattle more often. And that's one of the key things about this is you got to catch it early if you do have that problem, and then you can treat it and you can manage the cattle. So more management there, higher production costs just in the sense of medication and maybe veterinary cost. And then just the uncertainty piece, the concept of, take a producer who was thinking about expanding this year in an area that doesn't have screwworm versus a producer who was thinking about expanding this year in an area that, has had screwworm problems or is a threat, as a concern area. That producer that's trying to expand in an area where they're really worried about screwworms, they're probably going to be more hesitant to expand because they've got this additional risk, this additional challenge. So to me, it's a long run kind of higher cost of production. There's just another headwind to us trying to expand this cow herd. Yeah, so if we think about market impacts here, split it out, supply and demand. On the demand side, it really shouldn't be a huge impact. This is not a food safety issue. This is not something that, consumers should really be all that worried about as far as the safety of the food. Like the beef is still safe, it's not passed through, they're good there. But on the supply side, it increases cost of production. That usually leads to lower production, or in this case, it probably leads to slower expansion at some point, which, that's supportive of prices longer. So we may be in this period of tighter supplies for longer than we would have otherwise been. So no screwworm cases in Mississippi yet, and hopefully we don't have those. Hopefully we're able to contain it kind of in the area of South Texas that it's in. But we're far enough south that it's something that we got to be diligent about. We have got to be paying attention to this and watching it. Hopefully we never get it, but right now no cases in Mississippi. Yeah, so screwworm, it sounds big and scary. If you look at it, when it's in fly form, it looks really similar to common housefly. The key difference here is that the larva, when it's in that form, it feeds on living flesh instead of dead flesh. And so it's a big concern for livestock. It's a big concern for wildlife. Any animal that's got an open wound, if the worm gets in there, then it feeds on that living tissue, and it can cause, big injury and death of those animals. And so it's something you got to really be paying attention to. And sometimes you can't see those cuts very well, So the first few cases in Texas, I think the very first one in particular was in kind of the umbilical region of a newborn calf, so it's an area that you really got to be looking at these animals to be able to catch. So that's it. It's a challenge that the producers are going to have to deal with, especially if it's kind of in your area.
According to the USDA, the government expects to spend at least $850 million over the next few years to fight and eradicate, once again, the New World Screwworm. Failure to do so would cost producers as much as $100 billion.
On the lighter side, Eddie Smith is in Vicksburg again with the world's most popular flowering potted plant, the orchid. Here's Eddie with an Orchid Delight.
Today, we're in Vicksburg, Mississippi, visiting Tatiana Martin, who has turned her love for orchids into a thriving hobby of texture, color, and life. One of her most unique species is the Ladicia orchid, often called the jewel orchid. Unlike most orchids, this one is grown more for its foliage than its blooms. The velvety deep green leaves are traced with fine shimmering veins that almost glow in the light. It thrives in lower light conditions, making it perfect for a cozy corner or shaded area. When it does bloom, delicate sprays of tiny white flowers rise above the foliage like a soft finishing touch. Next is Phalaenopsis orchids. These are the orchids most people recognize, with their broad, arching sprays of blooms that seem to float in midair. Tatiana has several in bloom, ranging from pure white to soft pinks and even bold speckled patterns. These orchids are surprisingly beginner-friendly, thriving in indirect light and needing only occasional watering. With the right care, they'll rebloom year after year, each cycle just as stunning as the last. Dendrobium orchids are another type in her collection, which add height and drama. These orchids produce clusters of blooms along upright canes, creating a completely different look. Dendrobium appreciates a bit more light and a slightly different watering rhythm. But once you understand their needs, they reward you with an impressive floral display. You don't need a greenhouse or years of experience to grow orchids. A simple windowsill, a little patience, and a willingness to learn can go a long way. I'm Eddie Smith, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Southern Gardening.
We'll take a break right here, but don't go away. Coming up on our Farm Week feature, you've heard it before, one man's trash, another man's treasure. Politics aside, climate change is a priority for many, and the door is opening wider to capitalize on opportunities like methane, a greenhouse gas that actually traps more heat in the atmosphere than CO2. Ag waste is one source of methane used by one company to produce cheaper electricity, turning trash into power. That's coming up on Farm Week. Don't go away.
Mississippi, let's get moving. Join the Magnolia Moves Activity Challenge. The Mississippi State University Extension Service is offering this virtual challenge for individuals of any age or teams of family, colleagues, students, church members, or any other group. Join the 6-week April the 20th through May 31st challenge at no cost, and you'll set your own goals for becoming more active and eating healthier. You'll download the MoveSpring app or use the desktop version. Register for Magnolia Moves, and with automatic tracking, your movements and activities will be captured automatically to give you a clear, real-time view of your progress and achievements. Also, Extension will hold weekly prize drawings for participation across 5 different age categories. So join us and get fit and feel better, eat healthier, manage your weight, and exercise regularly. Magnolia Moves makes fitness accessible, practical, and enjoyable for everyone. Visit msuext.ms/Magnolia Moves to learn more, ask questions, and register today.
I believe in people and their hopes, their aspirations and their faith, and their right to make their own plans and arrive at their own decisions, and their ability and power to enlarge their lives and plan for the happiness of those they love. I believe that education, of which extension work is an essential part, is basic in stimulating individual initiative, self-determination, and leadership, that these are the keys to democracy, and that people, when given facts they understand, will act not only in their self-interest, but also in the interest of society. Because I believe these things, I am an extension professional.
Time for the market report, a focus on livestock this week.
We have an extended look into how things look both statewide and nationally due to all the current news. But first, the numbers. What were the week's biggest gains and losses? And then a cattle update. Dr. Josh Maples tells us how things look from a market standpoint so far this year and how it compares to previous ones. So markets closed again on the downswing with row crops the most heavily affected. Some serious price drops here. Let's take a look. The week's biggest gain, lumber up over $20.50, a 3.5% increase from the previous week. The week's biggest loss, corn, down 29.25 cents. That's more than a 6.5% decrease from the previous week. It should be noted that both soybeans and wheat also fell by 5% or more, so a significant price drop. And now we look closer at cattle, our nation's supply and health, a good bit in the news lately. I spoke with Extension livestock economist Dr. Josh Maples to get his take on the situation. But first, we review the latest cattle on feed report to give us the proper context. Cattle and calves on feed for the slaughter markets totaled over 11.5 million head, 2% higher than last year at this time. Placements in feedlots totaled over 1.5 million head, 6% higher than last year. Marketings of fed cattle during April also totaled over 1.5 million head, 10% down from last year. Other disappearance totaled 52,000 head, 4% up from last year.
Yeah, so cattle prices so far in 2026 have been stronger. I mean, we've seen some volatility quite a bit in futures markets in particular. But if you look at year over year cattle prices, we're above where we were last year, which really is to be expected given the tighter supplies that we've had. So I would call it stronger, but with some significant volatility, especially in cattle futures markets. Yeah, so beef on dairy trend, not as much in Mississippi just because we don't have as many dairy cattle as you see in other places. But it's absolutely something that's taken off nationwide. And we're seeing the impacts there in terms of especially the value of those calves, those crossbred calves is sharply higher than what a traditional Holstein calf was worth. I do think we're going to see some correction at some point. I mean, I think the genetics and just the technology, the feeding management, the feeding technology is allowing those calves to be worth more. So I don't think that's going away. I think we're going to continue to try to use those calves for beef. And quite frankly, we have always used those calves for beef. I mean, they've always, I think part of this, there's this thought that, hey, these are new animals. They're really not. You know, our dairy cow herd has remained remarkably consistent for years. And so those calves have always been being born. They've always turned into beef at some point. The key difference is now is they're more productive because of this genetic technology and management. So I think that's going to continue to be something that the industry deals with. I mean, I'm looking forward to the mid-year cattle report. So USDA puts out a July cattle inventory report. That report is not as comprehensive as the January 1 one that we get every year, but it does include heifers held back for beef replacements, and it also gives us an estimate of calf crop for the year. So two really important pieces of data. But, you know, just looking at how the year has gone so far, you know, we've still got quite a few headwinds to expansion, and definitely no clear signs that we're just retaining a bunch of heifers just yet. So I would say maybe we're kind of in that stabilization mode still, but no obvious signs that we're really expanding yet. Yeah, so the beef side is what's in the news all the time, right? We got really strong beef prices, but you know, we've had really strong beef prices for years now. And for, you know, certainly going back to 2022, 2023, we've been talking about this. And it really just goes back to the cycle, the point in the cycle that we're in. We're at the tightest supplies that we've been in a long time. And it takes years from the point that we start expanding the cow herd to the point where we actually see more beef on shelves. And so, you know, we haven't even got to the point yet where we see increased heifer retention in a meaningful way, which would be the kind of the precursor to more calves on the ground, which will then eventually be more beef in grocery stores. So beef prices are high because we've got really tight supplies of beef, we've got really tight supplies of cattle, and we haven't really yet seen that start to turn yet. So that's the main thing underpinning this. And then if you get into the kind of the things that affect that expansion, I think that's what's really key as we look forward. There's plenty of things that are making it more expensive and the things I'll just call headwinds to producers trying to expand, drought being a big one. Yeah, I would say on the cattle markets in particular, you know, we should expect this volatility to remain for a while. You know, we've got a lot of things bouncing around right now. One, we're in this point where we're trying to figure out, are we expanding or are we not? You know, so there's already kind of that piece that markets are trying to sort through. And then you layer in things like higher production costs, you layer in things like screwworm. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty in these markets. And so that's what leads us to these really big up and down days that we see in futures markets. Now, on the cash market side, you know, you go down to the auction barn to sell your cattle, we haven't seen as much volatility there on actually selling week to week. But day to day, as markets try to absorb this information, lots of volatility. And I think that's going to be around for a while, just given all the things that are feeding into these markets right now.
And that's it for a deeper look into the markets. Mike?
Thanks, Zach. Energy, always on the radar, especially these days, and more ways to generate it being refined all the time. Here's Josh Bittner with a new view on methane.
For the state of California, taking a bite out of climate change is a high priority. In recent years, more legislation has sought to bolster longtime efforts across the board, and for some, solidified the notion that one person's trash could be another's treasure.
I think the landfill industry has a vested interest in seeing better opportunities for the use of the methane we generate. It's definitely a fact that California does typically set the standard, and then other states follow in the successive years.
Merced County Regional Waste Management Authority Director James Moore says his Central Valley utility now annually diverts 25,000 tons of green waste material they would have previously buried. Subterranean decay does act as a carbon sink, but anaerobic conditions underground also produce volatile methane, a greenhouse gas 28 times more potent at trapping heat in the atmosphere than CO2, according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Under Senate Bill 1383, approved by former Governor Jerry Brown in 2016, and in effect as of 2022, residents and businesses are required to compost food and other organic waste in utility-provided carts. The goal is a 75% reduction in entombed organic waste by 2025. The action has opened the door for contractors and jurisdictions like Merced County to not only produce compost commodities for landscaping and soil development, but capitalize on existing mitigation systems. The renewable fuel standard has benefited U.S. corn growers by requiring a percentage of biofuels, like ethanol, be blended into the nation's fuel supply. But the federal mandate also covers biogas, a cellulosic or next-generation source, which also qualifies to generate renewable identification numbers, or RINs. These credits are sold to major polluters like the oil and gas industry to keep their emissions in check. California's low-carbon fuel standard, a similar state program, may be stacked with RINs to provide a dual windfall, an enticing incentive for a state at the forefront of the shift from gasoline to electric vehicles. Some say biofuels can help bridge the gap.
I think there's a real opportunity for biofuels, largely because they can be stored. If we shut down all the fossil fuel right now, the world would come to a screeching halt. We would starve, we would freeze. That's not the way we're going to be able to build a better world.
University of California Merced Distinguished Professor Dr. Sarah Kurtz spent more than 30 years working at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado. Her tenure in Merced has focused on integrating various energy sources to collectively drive down costs, with a focus on choice as opposed to government mandates.
California is definitely a leader. They're doing some things very, very well. I do want to raise a concern that one of the ways they've done it is to say we want to do it at whatever cost, and we end up then we have some of the most expensive electricity in the nation. If electricity prices go sky high, then who wants to electrify?
UC Merced staff are tackling today's challenges from various angles.
This area where we are in the Central Valley, there's a lot of generation of biomass, not only in the Sierras for the forest type of waste that is available, but also agricultural waste.
Dr. Gerardo Diaz says biocircular economies keep money on the farm, and techniques like using livestock compost bedding made from sterilized manure solids can help cut methane and other objectionable byproducts. Entrepreneurs who've worked with UC Merced are harnessing the rising tide of energy incentives to help float dairy operations of all size and scale.
It's not super sophisticated technology. It's a natural process. It doesn't get more simple than this. It's a covered lagoon capturing the methane that is being released from the microbial activity within the manure. It takes about 30 days for the biogas to be generated underneath the cover.
Aligned Digester's general manager, Omar Ramirez, says after purchasing the proper equipment, similar systems can generate power at 9 cents per kilowatt hour, as opposed to up to 22 cents from a local utility. He adds this dairy in Chowchilla, which milks 6,500 head, feeds his setup roughly 350,000 gallons of liquid waste daily, which can generate around 2 megawatts of power. Net metering can further offset inputs, while even more potential remains.
On the plus side, if you're doing renewable natural gas, you could also power your fleet on site to haul your milk, to haul your feed. It's really easy to really create a circular loop.
Critics charge this bevy of benefits encourages booming herds and exponential greenhouse gas. But Ramirez sees it as a hedge.
The dairy market is very volatile. In our mind, it's dairy first, and how are we going to help the dairymen generate that additional revenue stream while helping the environment and also putting a little bit more money in their pocket for the hard times.
Professor Kurtz, featured in that story, makes a good point. Quote, if we shut down all fossil fuels, the world would come to a screeching halt. If we learn nothing else from that Texas power grid failure 5 years ago, it's that fossil fuels are more reliable, at least until other technologies are perfected. Well, next week, by now, you may have heard that after nearly 50 years on the air, Farm Week is coming to a close.
On our last couple of shows in June, we'll reminisce about what has made our time on the air so special.
We'll also speak with Artis Ford and Leighton Spann, two men who anchored the show for decades.
It's the end of an era.
Part one of our goodbye next time on Farm Week.
Remember, if you missed a story, look for past episodes of Farm Week on our website at farmweek.tv.
And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and YouTube. See you next week. Thanks for watching.